Welcome back. Thus far, we've seen how we can use pivot tables to break down summary statistics about our data, number of calls, total abandoned calls, and average call duration by a single dimension, the site where the calls were taken. But what if we wanted to slice and dice our data in more ways than one? Fortunately, pivot tables make this kind of multi-layered analysis intuitive and fast. Let's see how this works by building on our example from the last video. First, by way of briefly recapping Pivot Tables 101, I'll recreate that pivot table from the previous video, but this time from an Excel table instead of a range. So here we have the same data set as in the last video, but it's been converted to an Excel table called call data. So it turns out that this makes the process of creating a pivot table, but also keeping that pivot table source data up to date a lot easier than simply creating a pivot table from a range. So as long as I have any cell within this table selected, if I just go to Insert and then Pivot Table, Excel correctly guesses that I want to use this table, which I've named Call Data, as the source of my pivot. So I don't have to worry about highlighting any cells. Merely having one of those cells inside the table selected is enough. And just like in the last video, I'll choose New Worksheet and then click OK. And now we're back to our familiar Pivot Table Command Center. Now before I start dragging and dropping fields to recreate our pivot table, I want to again emphasize the advantage of creating a pivot table from an Excel table versus a range. Not only did it make it easier for me to create this pivot table, but as I add more data to that table, my pivot table will pick up on those changes automatically, versus me having to reselect a larger range every time more data is added. Alright, so to recreate our pivot from the last video, I'll first drag Site under my Rows area, and then Call ID in Values, and then I'll convert that calculation to be Account, and then Call Duration, which I will convert to be an average instead of a sum. And finally, calls abandoned, which I will leave as the default sum. But the real point of this video is going to be to add more layers to our analysis. So in the spirit of showing more than telling, which is generally conducive to the learning process when explaining pivot tables, I'm just going to drag another field into our rows area. And that will be employee name. So I'll drag that under our site heading. And now we see that under each site heading, we have a list of all of the employees who work at that site with their individual statistics broken out. And then on the rows where the actual name of the site is listed, the summary statistics for that site overall are listed. Now I'll add another layer to this by dropping in manager name below site but above employee name in our rows area. And now if I scroll up, you'll see that we have yet another layer in our hierarchy. Under our Aurora, Colorado site, we see the next level in the hierarchy down is the names of our managers. And then below each of those managers, we have the names of all of their employees. And at each level of the pivot table, whether it be site, manager, or employee, we see the statistics specific to that particular level to the right of that entity in the rows area. So a couple things I want to clarify before we move on. One is that you can think of each number in the pivot table as a kind of intersection or address of any number of filters that are being applied in the rows area or the columns area of the pivot table. So if I look at this number 89 here in cell C7, that number represents the sum of abandoned calls at the intersection of our Aurora, Colorado site, a manager named Elsie Taplin, and an employee named Aleda Singh. So that metric is being calculated only for rows in our data where all three of those conditions are true. Where our site is Aurora, Colorado, our manager is Elsie Taplin, and our employee is Aleda Singh. Likewise, if we move up to cell C5, this number 643 represents all the abandoned calls where the manager was Elsie Taplin and the site was Aurora, Colorado, but because we're only at the second level of the pivot table hierarchy and not the third, no employee level filters are being applied to that number. And lastly, this 1,981 here just represents all the abandoned calls at the Aurora, Colorado site. Now, the other point I want to make is in regards to your decision as to how to order your fields in the rows area of the pivot table fields list. So your general rule should be fields with fewer distinct values, like for example site, should go highest in the hierarchy, and fields with more distinct values should go lowest. Take for example what would happen if I moved employee name to the very top of our list of fields in our rows area. So if I click this arrow next to employee name, and then choose move to beginning, our pivot table still produces accurate numbers, but these hierarchies are no longer meaningful. Instead of a larger site level number being broken out by smaller subtotals, those being for manager and employee, we instead start with the smallest subtotal. So our total for our first employee here listed, and then the subtotal for the site, and then the further subtotal for employee are all the same number. So again, you want to think of this as a hierarchy where the field with the fewest distinct values goes first, and so on. So I'll move employee back to the bottom of the hierarchy by clicking our arrow here and choosing move to end. And now lastly, just to demonstrate that you can have fields in the columns area as well as the rows area in the same pivot table, I'm going to drag our call type description field into the columns area. And now just to make a little bit more room, I'm going to close out of our pivot table fields list here. And while you could correctly argue that this pivot table is getting a little busy, it's still providing us a pretty powerful and condensed summary of a reasonably large amount of data that we have on our data worksheet. So moving horizontally across the top of the pivot, we see that we have 3 primary columns, one for each call type description, billing, sales, and tech support. And then under each of those primary columns, we have 3 secondary columns for each of our metrics. So basically these metrics are subheadings under each of the primary headings that are our call type descriptions. And just to extend the analogy that we used earlier about each of these numbers representing a kind of intersection or address among all the different fields that have been dragged into the row area or column area, if we look at this number 28 here in cell C12, this represents the number of abandoned calls that had a call type description of billing that were taken at the Aurora, Colorado site, that were taken by an employee whose manager was Elsie Taplin, and that were taken by the employee whose name was Sheila Garcia. Now just to confirm that, let me go back to my data worksheet, and I'll first filter for site equals Aurora, Colorado, and then I'll look at my manager name field and look for our manager. So we're filtering for Elsie Taplin. And then I'll look for our employee in the employee name field, and that was Sheila Garcia. And lastly, I'll filter for call type description equals billing. And then I'll filter for call abandoned equals 1, which should give us our count of abandoned calls. And we'll see if we apply all those filters that 28 records were returned, which is, of course, the number reflected in our pivot table for the intersection of all those distinct values. Now, before we move on, I want to demonstrate a technique you can apply to condense the output of pivot tables as they can grow somewhat more elaborate like the one we see here. So looking at our row headings, you'll see that there are these little minus signs next to the top 2 levels among our fields in our rows area. So if I click this minus sign next to Elsie Taplin, suddenly all the detail data underneath her disappears. And then if I click the plus sign next to her, it reappears. Now you can also do this at the site level. So I can click this minus sign next to Aurora, Colorado, and then all the data under that collapses. And then I can again get it back just by clicking the plus sign. Obviously this isn't applicable to the headings at the lowest level of the hierarchy, that being employee. Now if you want to collapse a certain level of the hierarchy for the entire pivot table and not just a single section, you can actually right-click any entity at that level of the hierarchy and then hover over Expand and Collapse and then choose Collapse Entire Field. And now for our entire pivot table, the detail has been collapsed to the level of site and manager with individual employees no longer being visible. But then if I right-click any of these managers and then hover over Expand and Collapse and then choose Expand Entire Field, now all of our employees are visible yet again. Now before we move on, let's swap out the row labels on our pivot table with something perhaps a little more interesting, a date. But first we need to get our pivot table field list back. So how do we do that? Well, you might have noticed at the top right corner of our ribbon that we have this new contextual ribbon tab, just like we see when we click inside of an Excel table. And that, of course, is because we have clicked inside of this pivot table. So if we click this Pivot Table Analyze tab, we'll see that we have a whole set of controls specific to pivot tables. Now, the one we need to show our field list again is this Field List button at the very top right. If we click that, our field list reappears. So our goal here is to remove Site, Manager, and Employee from our rows area and replace that with our call timestamp field, which lists the date and time on which a call was placed. So to remove fields from the pivot table, you don't even have to click in the rows area or the columns area. Instead, you can simply uncheck them from the fields list here. So I can scroll down and uncheck employee name, uncheck site, and uncheck manager name. Now this is a fairly uninteresting pivot at this point, but all we have to do to fix that is just drag in call timestamp to our rows area. And right away we see something interesting. Even though our call timestamp field simply had date time values, Excel has automatically grouped these values by month. And then if we click this now familiar plus sign under May, we'll see that our May calls have been broken out by individual date. So Excel clearly has some built-in intelligence around how to handle date and time values in a pivot table. But we don't have to depend on Excel's artificial intelligence to decide how to group date values. So let's say I decided I didn't want months to be included in my pivot. I certainly didn't explicitly ask for that, Excel just assumed that I wanted it. How would I remove that? Before I make that tweak, I'm actually going to change the layout of our pivot table field list over here to make it a little easier to work with when we're focusing on the rows, columns, and values areas. So I'll click the arrow next to this little gear icon, and then choose Areas Section Only 2x2. And now I have a much clearer view of the fields in the different areas of my pivot. So you'll see that Excel has automatically added this months pseudo field above my call timestamp field in the rows area. But I can click the arrow next to that and choose Remove Field. And now my data is broken out just by date. But what if I wanted to add some other sort of date grouping? Maybe I wanted my data to be broken out by year, month, and date. To do that, I would simply right-click any of the date values in my row labels, and then choose Group. And you'll see that by default, Excel assumes, and this is the assumption we saw it make earlier, that we want to group by days and months. But clearly we have a lot of other options here. We can also group by years if we want, quarters, or even hours, minutes, and seconds. So I'm actually going to uncheck years, but then select hours. So now we should see our data broken out by month, day, and even hour of the day. So now I'll click OK. And now instead of just seeing patterns in how our calls arrive on days of the month, we also can see hourly level trends, which is a whole new level of analysis. So lastly, before we go, I'll just change my pivot table field list layout to its default. So I'll click again this gear icon and then choose Field Section and Area Section Stacked. Now speaking of layout and appearances, we haven't been paying much attention to the aesthetic appeal of our pivot table. Up to this point, we've focused strictly on number crunching. But up next, we'll explore some of the ways that you can customize the format, look, and feel of your pivot tables. I'll see you then.